It was a cold night at St. Joseph's Hospital. The clock on the reception desk read 22, but the unusual silence seemed to say that it was much later. Nurse Lisa was on her usual shift, organizing charts, when the distinct sound of a door closing echoed in the empty corridor. Intrigued, she got up to investigate. As she turned down the corridor, she found the door to room 214 closed. Strange, given that this was the room of Margaret, a terminally ill 70-year-old patient who was awaiting euthanasia at dawn. Lisa hesitated. She looked through the small peephole in the door, and in an instant, her body froze. Inside the room, a snow-white cat with eyes as bright as coals was lying comfortably on Margaret's lap. It was impossible. Animals didn't have access to the hospital. How did this happen? She thought, as her hand trembled as she reached for the intercom to call security. Within minutes, 2 security guards arrived. They tried to open the door, but it seemed locked from the inside. Margaret had never shown the strength to even raise her arm, and now the situation seemed even more inexplicable. The silence inside the room was disconcerting, broken only by the occasional sound of soft breathing. When they finally managed to open the door with the master key, the scene they found was even more disconcerting. Margaret, who until then had been in a coma, was awake. Her clear blue eyes shone with a vitality that no one expected. She stroked the cat gently, a slight smile on her lips. The staff were in shock. The doctor on duty, Dr. Collins, quickly approached. "Margaret, how did you—" He couldn't complete the sentence, the confusion in his mind preventing him from formulating a coherent question. Margaret looked at him with a serenity that seemed supernatural and murmured, "Salem, he's back." The atmosphere became heavy. Lisa, struggling to understand the scene, asked, "Do you know this cat?" Margaret nodded. "He's mine. Or rather, he was mine, many years ago. He left when my daughter left." The silence that followed was absolute, interrupted only by the purrs of Salem, who seemed as calm as Margaret herself. As the staff exchanged perplexed glances, something in the air seemed to announce that the night held even greater mysteries. And then the light in the corridor flickered briefly, and a shiver ran down everyone's spine. It was as if the whole hospital knew that something extraordinary had just happened. While the cat remained serene on Margaret's lap, the murmurs among the staff in the corridor only increased. Dr. Collins, visibly disconcerted, closed the door to give the old woman some privacy. He needed to understand what was going on. Inside the room, Margaret, now more lucid than she had been in months, looked deeply at Salem. Her slender fingers slid through the cat's soft fur, as if seeking comfort and memories of better times. Lisa, still incredulous, decided to go into the bedroom and sat down beside the bed. "Margaret, you said this was your cat? How long ago?" asked Lisa, trying to keep her voice calm despite the adrenaline she was feeling. The elderly woman sighed, as if reliving a distant memory. "Salem was just a puppy when I found him over 20 years ago. I rescued him from a storm in my old home in Albany, but he was never really mine. He was my daughter's, my Helen's." Lisa leaned a little closer. "Helen? You never mentioned you had a daughter." Margaret swallowed dryly, her voice breaking. "Helen was my life, my only daughter. I gave her Salem as a present on her 18th birthday. They were inseparable." She paused, her eyes watering. "But the day she left, he was with her." The air seemed to freeze in the room. The silence was so dense that only the sound of Salem's purrs filled the space. Lisa put her hand on Margaret's shoulder, encouraging her to continue. "Helen died in a car accident," Margaret whispered, looking up at the ceiling. "I always knew she had an adventurous spirit, and that day, she was driving alone to visit a friend in another city. The car lost control on the wet road. When they called to tell me the news, they said that no one had survived. Helen and Salem." Lisa blinked, fighting back tears. What Margaret was saying seemed impossible. If Salem was in the accident and had died, how could he be here now, decades later, in that room? Margaret, as if guessing the nurse's thoughts, smiled slightly. "I thought he was dead too. For years I blamed myself for not being there, for not protecting either of them. But now he's here. It's as if he's come for me." At that moment, Dr. Collins entered the room, his rigid posture trying to hide his obvious discomfort. He approached the bed, holding the chart. "Margaret, Your vital signs are normal. To be honest, they've improved dramatically. But what you're telling us, well, it's hard to understand. Margaret looked him straight in the eye, something rare for someone who seemed to have lost the strength to live so long ago. You don't have to understand, Doctor. Salem is more than a cat. He's a piece of Helen. He always has been. And now he's come back because it's time for me to go. Lisa and Collins exchanged glances. Margaret's words sounded both reassuring and terrifying. Salem, as if he understood what was being said, got up from Margaret's lap, turned around and lay down again, curling up protectively. Outside the room, the staff continued to whisper about what had happened. Some mentioned reports of shadows they had seen in the corridors on previous nights, while others swore they had heard the sound of footsteps when no one was around. The atmosphere of mystery seemed to grow. Lisa, finally overcome by curiosity, asked, "And what do you feel now, Margaret?" The old woman closed her eyes with an almost supernatural serenity. "Peace," she replied, "as if everything is finally in place. I know I'm not alone." In the distance, a lamp flickered in the corridor, casting an oscillating glow in the room, as if the hospital itself were witnessing that moment. The feeling that something other than natural was afoot became impossible to ignore. Outside room 214, the atmosphere of unease intensified. Nurses whispered in small groups, exchanging hypotheses about Salem's mysterious appearance and Margaret's sudden state of lucidity. However, no one had the courage to re-enter the room without an urgent reason. It seemed as if that space now belonged to something beyond comprehension. In the break room, Lisa approached Michael, the security guard in charge of the night shift. "Did you see anything on the cameras before the cat appeared in Margaret's room?" she asked, in an almost whispered tone. Michael adjusted his cap, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I've reviewed the recordings. The cat just appeared. There's no footage of him entering the lobby, the corridors, nothing. It's as if he was already in there." Lisa was stunned. "That doesn't make sense. No animal gets in here without going through at least 2 automatic doors. Are you sure?" Michael nodded, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "And there's something else. The last few nights, strange things have been happening. Lights flashing in corridors where no one is, motion sensors activating without explanation. And now this." He paused, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "I don't believe in ghosts, but I don't know, Lisa. That cat, he gives me the creeps." Meanwhile, in room 214, Margaret was as calm as ever. Salem was still by her side, like a faithful sentinel. Lisa, reluctant to leave the old woman alone, decided to go back to her room. As she entered, she noticed that Margaret was muttering something quietly. "What are you saying, Margaret?" asked Lisa, approaching the bed. Margaret opened her eyes slowly and smiled. "I'm telling Salem about Helen. He already knows, of course, but it's nice to remember together. She loved to sing it to sleep. It's like I can hear her now." Lisa felt a shiver run up her spine. Before she could reply, a distant sound began to echo down the corridor, a soft, melancholy melody, as if someone was singing a lullaby. Lisa immediately turned around, trying to locate the source. When she opened the door, she found the corridor empty. The sound disappeared as quickly as it had started. "Did you hear that, Margaret?" asked Lisa, her voice trembling. "I did. Helen used to sing that song to Salem. I think he brought her voice with him," said Margaret, with a calm smile that contrasted completely with Lisa's growing dread. Shortly afterwards, Dr. Collins called a meeting with the medical team to discuss the situation. "There's no rational explanation for what's happening," he said, running his hand over his tired face. "Margaret's improvement is undeniable, but there's nothing in the medical records or the tests to justify this recovery." "What about the cat?" asked one of the nurses, visibly uncomfortable. "He's there as if he's part of it all. It's as if he had a purpose." Collins sighed. "If I mentioned that in an official report, I'd be ridiculed. But we can't ignore the fact that he's linked to the change in Margaret's condition." As the team discussed, reports of mysterious events began to circulate among the staff. One nurse claimed to have seen a shadow pass through the glass of the operating room, even though no one was inside. Another employee said he felt a cold draft in the warehouse, even though all the windows were closed. Lisa, increasingly involved in the mystery, decided to spend more time with Margaret. When she entered the room again, she noticed something that made her stop midway. On the bedside table, there was an old photograph that hadn't been there before. The picture showed Margarethe, a young girl who must have been Helen, and Salem, still a puppy. "Margarethe, where did that picture come from?" asked Lisa, her voice trembling. Margarethe looked at the picture with tenderness. "That's our last photo together. I kept it with me for years, but when I fell ill, I thought I'd lost it. Salem must have brought it back." Lisa felt her heart race. "But how is that possible?" Margarethe simply smiled. "There are things we can't explain, my dear, but I know that Salem is here for a reason. He came to take me home." At that moment, the light in the room flickered again, and a faint purring echoed through the room, as if it were louder than it should have been. Lisa didn't know if she was witnessing a miracle or something much bigger and scarier. The atmosphere in room 214 was filled with a strange peace, but the mystery was intensifying. Salem remained by Margarethe's side, purring in a rhythm that seemed synchronized with the old woman's breathing. Lisa, still torn between fascination and disbelief, couldn't move away. Margarethe, on the other hand, seemed to be in complete harmony with the cat's presence. "He's not just here for me," Margarethe said suddenly, looking at Lisa as if reading her thoughts. "You feel it too, don't you?" Lisa hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I feel something, yes. I can't explain it, but it's as if this room has changed since he arrived. Everything seems calmer, heavier too, in a strange way." Margarethe smiled, her face lighting up with an air of acceptance. "It's because he brought part of the other side with him." "The other side?" Lisa repeated, confused. Margarethe stretched out on the bed, her body visibly stronger than before. "I felt it as soon as he came in. It's not just my Salem. He's with Helen. I can feel my little girl. She's so close, Lisa. I can almost touch her." Lisa took a step back, struggling to process what she was hearing. It was as if Margarethe's words were beyond logic, but the tone of her voice and the serenity in her eyes made it impossible to ignore. "Margarethe, this isn't normal," Lisa said, trying to remain calm. "Don't you think it might be your mind creating this to find comfort?" Margarethe laughed softly, a sweet sound, but laden with melancholy. "My dear, when you're as close to death as I am, you learn to recognize what's real and what's not. Salem is here because it's time for me to go. Helen sent him." Before Lisa could reply, the bedroom door creaked softly, opening just enough to let in a breath of cold air. Instinctively, Lisa looked down the empty corridor, but the movement seemed more intentional than accidental. On the other side of the hospital, Dr. Collins was meeting with the administration to decide the next steps regarding Margarethe. "She's lucid, healthier than she's been in months," he argued, still trying to hold on to science. "Perhaps we should postpone euthanasia." One of the administrators, however, frowned. "This is highly irregular. The request was made, all the legal procedures were followed, and Margarethe was in agreement. We can't just change our minds because she's had a temporary improvement." "Temporary," Collins retorted. "There's no explanation for what we're seeing. I'd like to believe that it's something natural, but I have to admit that it's beyond my comprehension. That cat, Salem, he—" The administrator interrupted him, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Do you really want to document that a cat changed the condition of a terminally ill patient? Do you hear what you're saying?" Collins remained silent, but deep down he knew she was right. And yet, something inside him wouldn't let him dismiss the inexplicable. Back in the bedroom, Margarethe reached out a trembling hand to Lisa. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but full of determination. "I don't think so," Lisa replied, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. "But Margarethe, what you're saying is hard to accept." Margarethe stroked Salem's head, who stared at her as if listening to every word. "Then let me show you." Margarethe closed her eyes, and for a moment the room seemed to sink into a deep silence. Then Salem raised his head and let out a low, almost melodic meow. Suddenly, Lisa felt the air change, as if the atmosphere around her had become denser. She heard a soft laugh, like a child's, echoing from somewhere. She looked around, but saw no one. "You heard that, didn't you?" Margarethe asked, her eyes still closed. Lisa felt a lump in her throat. "I heard it," she admitted, her heart racing. "It was a laugh. From a child." Margaret opened her eyes and smiled. "It's Helen. She's here, Lisa. Don't be afraid. She just came to get me." Before Lisa could react, Margaret's heart monitor beeped softly, indicating a slight oscillation. Salem jumped off her lap and positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the door. The light in the room flickered again, and a sensation of warmth flooded the space. Lisa felt tears welling up in her eyes, not knowing if it was fear or emotion. "Salem knows what he's doing," Margaret murmured, her voice growing weaker and weaker. "He's my guardian, and Helen's spirit is in him. She wants me alone." Salem let out a long meow, and the monitor beeped steadily again. Margaret, however, looked more tired. Lisa held her hand, noticing that she was colder. "Thank you for looking after me, Lisa," Margaret said with one last smile. "And take care of Salem. He'll need you after I'm gone." Before Lisa could reply, Margaret's eyes closed softly, and calm took over the room. Salem, still standing at the foot of the bed, looked at Lisa. It was as if he knew something she didn't. Lisa sat in the chair next to the bed, watching Margaret's serene expression. The room was enveloped in an almost unearthly stillness, interrupted only by Salem's faint purring. He now stood at the foot of the bed, staring at Lisa with deep eyes, as if he wanted to convey something. Suddenly, the heart monitor, which until then had been emitting weak signals, began to beep more regularly. Margaret's vital signs were showing a completely unexpected pattern. Lisa widened her eyes and checked the numbers on the equipment. It was impossible. Margaret's condition seemed to be improving inexplicably. A few minutes later, Dr. Collins entered the room. "Lisa, what's going on?" he asked, noticing the change in the equipment. Lisa stood up quickly. I don't know. She was weak a few minutes ago, almost out. And now, look at this." She pointed at the monitor. They both looked at Margaret, who opened her eyes slowly, as if she had woken up from a deep dream. "Margaret?" Collins called out, coming closer. "How are you feeling?" The old woman smiled. "I feel fine. Better than I've felt in years." Her voice, once so weak and hesitant, now sounded clear and firm. She raised a hand, touching Lisa's face gratefully. "You were here the whole time, weren't you?" Lisa nodded, still speechless. Collins, intrigued, took out his stethoscope and began to examine her. "Margaret, your blood pressure is stable. Your lungs seem clearer. I can't understand. Last night you could barely breathe without help." "It's not something to understand, Doctor," Margaret replied reassuringly. "It's Salem. He brought me strength. And he brought Helen, too. She told me to keep going a little longer." Collins frowned. "Margaret, I don't want to discredit you, but there's no medical explanation for what's happening." Lisa interrupted. "Doctor, with all due respect, maybe it's not something that medicine can explain." Collins sighed, recognizing that the situation was far beyond what he could logically justify. He made a quick note in his chart and left the room, muttering that he needed to update the team. Meanwhile, Lisa knelt beside the bed. "Margaret, do you really believe that Salem brought all this on himself? Not just him, but Helen too?" Margaret smiled, stroking the cat's head, who closed her eyes in apparent approval. "It's not a question of believing, Lisa. It's about knowing. Sometimes love transcends barriers we can't see. Helen wasn't ready to let me go, and Salem is the tie that binds us." Lisa felt a chill. She was beginning to accept that what was happening there was beyond human comprehension. The next morning, Margaret continued to make an impressive recovery. The doctors decided to postpone euthanasia indefinitely, claiming that she no longer met the medical criteria for the procedure. The news spread quickly through the hospital, leaving the staff both perplexed and relieved. "It's a miracle," commented one of the nurses to Lisa in the corridor. "You were there. What do you think happened?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "I think there are forces we don't understand. And Margaret, she was touched by one of them." Back in the bedroom, Salem still hadn't left Margaret's side. When Lisa brought the cat a bowl of water, Margaret looked at her thoughtfully. "You know he won't stay forever, don't you?" she asked. Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" "Salem has come to fulfill a mission," Margaret said softly. "He no longer belongs to this world. As soon as his task is complete, he will leave. But you don't have to worry. He knows he'll be remembered." Lisa looked at Salem, who seemed to understand them. The cat purred louder, a comforting sound that filled the room. Shortly afterwards, Margaret fell asleep, but it wasn't the heavy sleep of before. It was a peaceful rest, like someone who had finally found peace. Salem remained vigilant by her side, like a protective shadow. The medical team, still stunned, kept trying to find rational explanations for what had happened. But for Lisa, who had witnessed everything, there was no longer any doubt. Something extraordinary had happened in room 214. Something that went far beyond the world she knew. Dawn at St. Joseph's Hospital brought with it an aura of normality that seemed to defy the supernatural events of the night before. Margaret was sleeping peacefully, with a serene expression that the team hadn't seen for months. Salem, faithful as ever, was lying at the foot of the bed. But for Lisa, something seemed different that morning. As she reviewed Margaret's medical records in the restroom, a feeling of unease began to grow in her chest. It was as if the silence of the hospital was charged with something imminent. Determined, Lisa returned to room 214, but when she opened the door, she found Margaret's bed empty. Startled, she looked around and saw the old woman sitting in the armchair by the window, watching the morning sky. Salem was nowhere to be seen. "Margaret?" Lisa called out, her voice choppy. "Where's Salem?" Margaret turned her head slowly, the smile still soft on her lips. "He's gone, my dear. He's done what he needed to do." Lisa felt a squeeze in her heart. "What do you mean? He was here all night. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anyone come in. How could he just disappear?" Margaret looked out of the window, her eyes shining with a mixture of longing and gratitude. "Salem was never just a cat. You know that now, don't you? He was a messenger. And now that Helen and I are at peace, he's back where he belongs." Lisa tried to find logic in those words, but she knew it was impossible. Instead, she opened the door and ran through the hospital corridors, asking the staff if anyone had seen the cat. The security guards checked the cameras once again. Just as before, there was no record of Salem leaving. It was as if he had never been there. In the bedroom, Margaret, now fully awake, seemed more lucid than ever. When Lisa returned, frustrated and without answers, Margaret held her hand. "Lisa, you don't have to look for him. His presence will be with me and with you, even if you can't see him." "I can't accept that," Lisa said, feeling hot tears run down her face. "He was here, Margaret. He brought something. Something that changed everything." Margaret agreed, gently squeezing the nurse's hand. "Yes, he did. He brought peace, strength, and above all, love. And that doesn't go away." As Lisa struggled to contain her emotion, Margaret looked at her with a more serious gaze. "You were always with me, even when no one else was. And somehow Salem knew he could trust you too. When I'm no longer here, take care of your life with the same love that you take care of others. Promise me." Lisa nodded, the words stuck in her throat. "I promise." Over the next few hours, attempts to locate Salem were abandoned. The cat's disappearance became yet another unexplained chapter in a story that already defied any rational explanation. Margaret, however, seemed to grow stronger and stronger, talking to doctors and nurses as if she had been given a new lease of life. At the end of the day, Lisa was sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, observing the movement around her. Despite everything, she felt that Salem was still around, even if he was invisible. She looked up at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set, and a single star was already shining on the horizon. "Thank you, Salem," she murmured, letting a small smile escape. In the hospital, Margaret closed her eyes for another night's rest. Next to her, the pillow where Salem used to sleep was empty, but the room still seemed full of his presence. And so the mystery of Salem became a story that no one could forget. Margaret, the old woman who had lost everything, now found peace. Lisa, the skeptical nurse, found faith in the inexplicable. And Salem, the cat who had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived, left a legacy that would transcend time. The days following Salem's disappearance were marked by reflections and conversations among the staff at St. Joseph's Hospital. The episode in room 214 quickly became the stuff of legend among the staff, told in whispers in the corridors during night shifts. Lisa, who had been at the center of it all, felt profoundly transformed. Even with the void left by Salem, there was a comforting presence that seemed to accompany her. It was not uncommon for her to pass by room 214 and feel a familiar chill, as if the cat was still there, watching over Margaret. The elderly woman, for her part, seemed like a different person. The improvements continued, to the point where she began to walk short distances around the room with the help of a walker. The smile on her face was radiant, and the doctors still couldn't explain how someone who was on the verge of death could regain so much vigor. One morning, Lisa entered the room and found Margaret writing in a small notebook. "Good morning," she greeted, observing the old woman's concentrated expression. "What are you writing?" Margaret looked up and smiled. "I'm recording everything that's happened. People need to know that there is something beyond what we can see, something that connects us all, whether in this world or the next." Lisa sat down next to her, looking at the notebook. "Do you think anyone will believe it?" Margaret giggled. "It doesn't matter if they do. It matters that I believe it. And you too, right?" Lisa hesitated but nodded. "I do. After everything I've seen, there's no denying it." In the corridors of the hospital, other employees also shared stories of how Salem had impacted their lives, even if indirectly. One of the nurses said that on the night the cat appeared, she had a dream about her dead mother, something that helped her deal with a long-standing grief. One of the security guards confessed that, since that day, he had begun to reconsider his faith, something he had lost years ago. However, the mystery remained. Was Salem just a cat? A spirit? A messenger? For many, he was all that and more. A week later, Margaret was discharged. It was a momentous event for all those who had followed her recovery. Lisa helped her down to the hospital entrance, where an ambulance would take her to a more comfortable palliative care center. Before getting into the vehicle, Margaret held Lisa's hand. "Remember what you promised," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And remember that Salem wasn't just here for me. He was here for all of us." Lisa swallowed, fighting back tears. "I'll never forget, Margaret. I promise." As the ambulance drove away, Lisa felt a strange relief mixed with longing. It was as if a cycle had been closed. That same evening, Lisa decided to stop by room 214 once more. Although it was empty, she felt that the place still held the energy of recent events. As she entered, she noticed something that made her stop immediately. In the center of the bed, there was a single strand of black fur, glistening in the dim light. She smiled, touching the small thread carefully. It was a sign, she knew. Salem might be gone, but his legacy remained. On her way out, Lisa bumped into Dr. Collins, who watched her curiously. "You seem calm," he commented. "More so than the last few days?" Lisa shrugged, a small smile lighting up her face. "I think I've finally understood. Not everything needs an explanation. Sometimes you just have to accept it." Collins nodded, without asking any more questions. He knew that some things could never be explained by science, but that didn't diminish their value. And so the story of Salem and Margaret became more than a hospital legend. It became a symbol of hope, love, and the belief that certain connections are strong enough to transcend time and logic. Lisa left the hospital that night looking up at the stars. One of them seemed to shine more brightly than the others, and for a moment, she thought she heard a faint purring in the distance.